use cognitive appraisal to regulate your response to a stress event or an emotionally eliciting event. Before the event happens, you can regulate both your subjective response and your physiological response to the event. If you try after the fact to not experience the emotion that's evoked by the event, it actually makes the physiological response worse. So suppression bad, cognitive appraisal good. And what we found, and this is measured after the induction while they're doing some cognitive tests, what we found is that the young adults in the sad mood induction were way higher in their use of suppression than the young adult, than anybody else, actually. So everybody else is pretty much overlapping in their use of suppression, but the young adults just in that post-film induction condition made a lot more use of suppression. We got an age effect on appraisal, and oddly we found older adults using less suppression and less appraisal overall. So I'm not sure why older adults were using less emotion regulation, regardless of what condition. And it hasn't already occurred to you, the poem in that last slide is Cecilia that you met earlier this semester. And this is Cecilia's master's thesis that came out in Journal of Gerontology early this year. And what she used a different kind of mood induction, and also a way of making old age schema more salient for people in a fairly implicit sort of way. You ask people questions about things, and you can ask questions that tend to focus on age rather than questions that don't focus so much on age. And this has to do, on a Stroop task, this is attentional bias to symptom words. So it's the same kind of, like the colors Stroop that we played around with earlier in the semester. Here, again, your task is to name the colors, but some of the words are physical symptom words. And so the test is, if you're showing a focus on those words, it'll take you longer to name the color than it will if you're not focusing on these words. This is all older adults. And the effect here is there's two things being done. There's neutral versus sad mood, and then there's also no old age schema, and then old age schema induced. For people with neither, there's actually a tendency to react more quickly in color naming to the symptom words. So if anything, older adults in a neutral mood and without the age schema induced seem to be screening out the negative words very effectively. So they actually are less distracted by symptom words than they are by neutral words, which is one thing you might expect from some of Carson's work on attention and Laura Mather's work on attention and the positivity effect. In the neutral condition, if you induce the old age schema, that effect, positivity effect, sort of disappears. Similarly, if you don't have an old age schema, but you're in a sad mood, that protective effect disappears. If you're both in a sad mood and your old age schema is activated, you're now dwelling more on the physical words, and you're getting attentional bias in the physical words. In principle, we think this should have implications for how older adults can react to symptoms and process emotion and maturity and so forth. We've also looked some at anxiety as another kind of emotion, and for a lot of reasons, and there's actually some debate over whether things actually fall out quite this neatly in people's heads and hearts as it does in the literature. But in general, the focus with younger adults has been on attentional bias to threat and anxiety. So this is a notion that when you're in an anxious state, you perceive threat everywhere, and when you're more relaxed, you don't see threat so much. And this fits into kind of evolutionary arguments, and there's value to being afraid if there really are threats around, and then you're kind of in a hyper-aroused state, and you're more attentive to, you're padding through the jungle and have a reason to be afraid that there are tigers in the area, then cracking sticks to crack your attention in a way that you don't if you think you're in a safe environment. One of the issues here is that, as you know from earlier parts of the course, older adults have attentional focus deficits without regard to motion state. So the effects of anxiety on anxiety-related attentional bias and threat haven't really been explored very much. We did a couple of studies several years ago with one of my doctoral students with both a dot probe task and then a Stroop effect that you'll see in a minute. Dot probe is a task where you're presented with, in this case it was threatening words and neutral words, and then you're supposed to press a button when a dot appears, and the words are presented in pairs up and down on the screen, and so you could have neutral words presented together, or you can have one of the words either up or down being a threat word. And the calculated attention bias is, are you faster to respond to the dot when that comes up and you're supposed to hit the button when the dot appears where a threat word has been, and slower when it appears in the place where a neutral word has been when there was a threat word in the opposite place. So is your attention following the threat in a way that makes you slower to respond to the dot as the dot comes up. And what we see here is a slight effect for low trait anxious older adults. These are all older adults who are either low or high on a trait anxiety measure. Low trait anxious older adults show a little bit of a tendency to actually block out the threat words. High anxious older adults are pretty much right at zero. With induced anxiety, both groups show attentional bias to threat. And we've had this problem twice now in trying to induce anxiety in the lab. When Lauren Fox was doing this, she used these reading passages, and this was well before 9/11, but one of the passages was on the risk of toxic threats in the environment, and then the other one was something that was deadly boring from a similar government agency. We looked at a lot of different kinds of things and for various reasons. Mostly because a lot of the things that people use for threat induction or stress induction, I think, are not specifically anxiety-inducing enough. But we actually did have a young adult group, and we were not able. We were so worried about inducing anxiety in the older group, we sort of assumed it was going to work in the young group, and we didn't induce anxiety in the young group. We also made some different. We had to make some changes in the attentional tasks so that the older adults could do it, and I think it kind of wiped out some of our effects with the young group there too. Anyway, in the induced anxiety condition, both irrespective of trait level of anxiety, older adults were showing an attentional bias to threat. On the dot probe task, on the Stroop task, in this case it's threat words and you're naming the colors again. In the neutral condition, you see attentional bias to threat for the high anxious older adults. In the induced anxiety condition, you show attentional bias to threat for the low trait anxious adults. When you combine high trait anxiety and induced anxiety, you get a much lower effect. And when it's actually not different, statistically different from zero. And so again, like the young adults with the 1 week old memories a few slides back, if you crank up the anxiety level high enough, you actually sort of get lower levels of results.
And that's a self-protection thing?
Probably. That's what people understand it to be. Like in young adults, you tend to see this with phobic young adults.